Bitterroot Valley, Montana, September 1879. The air, crisp with the coming autumn, carried the scent of pine and the metallic tang of distant snow. Along the creek bottoms, the cottonwoods were already turning a brittle, luminous gold. It was a season for building, for chinking logs and stacking firewood, for bracing against the inevitable siege of a Montana winter. And on a small, wind-swept parcel of land granted under the Homestead Act, a woman was building something that made no sense. Marit Era's cabin was not rising from the earth. It seemed to be sinking into it. While her neighbors, the Gables and the Clarks, were hoisting heavy 8-foot pine logs into proud, tall walls, Marit was digging. She and her husband Lars had excavated the cabin's footprint a full foot below the surrounding prairie grass. Her walls, when she finally began to lay them, were of smaller, leaner logs, and they rose to a height that barely cleared Lars's head. Clive Seddon, the territorial land registrar, reined in his horse, his face a mask of official disapproval. He was a man who believed in rules, in plumb lines and square corners, in the civilizing geometry of settlement. He saw none of that here. Beside him, Jedediah Crane, a trapper, whose face was a roadmap of past winters, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "What in God's name is that? A root cellar with a chimney," Crane muttered, loud enough for Merritt to hear. Seddon dismounted, his boots crunching on the wood shavings. "Mrs. Era," he began, his tone freighted with bureaucratic gravity, "I am obligated to inspect the improvements on all claims. The territorial standards for a habitable dwelling are quite clear. Minimum wall height to the eave is 7 feet. This appears to be a pit." Marit Era paused, a small adze in her hand. She was a compact woman, her face weathered by a sun and a wind that were not of this continent. She looked at the two men, her eyes calm and unreadable. "It will be taller in December," she said, her voice quiet, with the lilting cadence of her native Norwegian. Crane chuckled. "You plan on adding another course of logs in a blizzard, ma'am?" Seddon's lips tightened. "This is no joking matter. A structure that does not meet code cannot be certified as a completed improvement. Your claim could be voided. This is foolishness. You'll be buried alive or freeze in a hole in the ground." He gestured with a leather-gloved hand at the sturdy, conventional cabin of the Gable family, a quarter-mile distant. "That is a proper home, Mrs. Era. That is how one survives a winter here." Mare offered no argument. She simply turned back to her work, the adze making a soft, rhythmic thump as she shaped a notch. The mockery of the men, the official threat from the registrar, seemed to fall away from her, as meaningless as the dry leaves skittering past on the wind. She was not building for Clive Seddon's rulebook. She was building for the mountain siege to come. What did this Sami woman, who had spent her life following reindeer herds across the frozen tundra of Finnmark, understand about the physics of snow that a territorial registrar and a valley of seasoned American pioneers had missed? The answer is the difference between fighting the cold and partnering with it. It's a lesson written not in books of law, but in the deep, accumulated wisdom of survival in the harshest climates on Earth. And before this story is over, I promise you will understand the profound thermal science behind letting a blizzard become your blanket. If you find value in these stories of forgotten ingenuity, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. It allows us to continue unearthing these incredible histories. And let us know in the comments, have you ever used a method that seemed strange to others, but you knew would work? We'd love to hear your story. Marit Era was not a carpenter, not a farmer, not a frontierswoman in the American sense. She was Sami, a child of the high Arctic plateau where Norway, Sweden, and Finland meet. Her inheritance was not a plot of land, but a knowledge of movement, of herds, of a world defined by 8 distinct seasons, most of them variations of winter. Her hands were not trained to the broadaxe and the saw, but to the graceful curve of a ski, the tension of a reindeer harness, the construction of a goaji, the traditional Sami dwelling. It was a structure of bent birch poles and hides, a low dome designed to be banked with sod in the summer and to disappear completely under insulating snow in the winter. In her world, a structure that stood tall against the wind was a structure that would be scoured, frozen, and ultimately defeated. Shelter was found by yielding, by going low, by inviting the snow to become a second, thicker wall. Her first winter in the Bitterroot Valley, in 1878, had been a brutal and nearly fatal education in the failure of the American way. They had built as their neighbors did, a tall log cabin with a steep pitched roof to shed the snow. It was a monument to hard work, a testament to the pioneer spirit. It was also a thermal catastrophe. As the temperature plunged, that proud cabin became their enemy. The thick log walls, which looked so substantial, bled heat ceaselessly. The wind, hitting the flat, tall walls, created a pressure differential that sucked warm air out through 1,000 tiny gaps in the chinking. Maret could feel the drafts as physical things, icy tendrils that snaked across the floor. They burned through their entire winter's supply of cordwood by January, and Lars spent his days in the biting cold, felling and bucking deadfall just to keep them from freezing. The card from her first winter tells the tale. Wall gaps whistled a constant, mournful tune. A bucket of water placed 5 feet from the roaring stove would be skimmed with ice by morning. The children, Niels and Solveig, slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned. Maret remembered looking at the thick frost coating the interior walls, a glittering, beautiful lattice of death, and realizing that the American cabin was designed with a fundamental misunderstanding of winter. It was built to fight, to stand defiant, and it was losing. That spring, as the valley thawed, she walked the perimeter of their failed shelter. She looked at the mountains, at the way the snow lingered in drifts in the hollows and behind ridges. She remembered the goaji of her childhood, warm and snug under a 10-foot blanket of snow, heated by a single small fire. She told Lars, "Next winter, we do not fight the snow. We invite it to stay." He had suffered enough in the tall cabin to trust her. To understand the genius of Maret's design, one must first understand the specific failures of the conventional frontier cabin. The problem wasn't the logs themselves, or the skill of the builders. The problem was a misplaced faith in simple mass as a defense against the cold. A typical cabin in the Bitterroot, like the one belonging to the Gable family, was a study in honest, hard-won, and deeply flawed construction. Silas Blackwood, the local logger, had sold them prime, 12-inch lodgepole pine logs. They had spent weeks fitting them, packing the gaps with a mixture of mud and dried moss. From the outside, it looked impregnable, a fortress of wood. But physics is an unforgiving judge. The primary enemy in a Montana winter is not just low temperature, it is the movement of heat. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction through solid objects, convection through the air, and radiation as infrared energy. The standard cabin failed on all 3 fronts. First, conduction. A solid pine log, 12 inches thick, feels substantial. But wood is a relatively poor insulator. It has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 1 per inch, so a 12-inch wall provided an R value of 12. This was simply not enough to stop the steady flow of heat from a 70-degree interior to a minus 20-degree exterior. The warmth generated by their fireplace was literally being conducted right through the walls and lost to the wilderness. Second, and far more devastating, was convection, amplified by air infiltration. A log cabin is inherently leaky. No matter how well chinked, there are hundreds of linear feet of seams between logs, around window frames, and at the corners. The relentless valley wind, pressing against the tall, flat walls, created immense air pressure. This pressure forced cold, dense, -20-degree air into the cabin through every crack, while simultaneously pushing the precious, warm, buoyant air up and out through gaps in the ceiling and roof. The Gables were not just heating their cabin. They were attempting to heat the entire Bitterroot Valley. This is why their fire had to roar constantly, consuming cords of wood at an astonishing rate. The flickering of a candle flame near a wall was a visible indicator of this constant, ruinous air exchange. Finally, radiation. The single-pane glass windows, a luxury on the frontier, were thermal holes. Heat radiated directly through them, and the cold inner surface of the glass chilled the air inside, creating miserable drafts as the cold air sank to the floor. The Gables were doing everything right according to the accepted wisdom of the frontier. They were industrious, they were careful, and they were freezing. Their home was not a shelter, it was a machine for burning wood. A constant battle against an enemy that had already breached the gates. Their suffering was not a result of laziness, but of a flawed design philosophy. Marit Era's construction project was a direct repudiation of that philosophy. Her work was methodical, each step a deliberate counter-move against the failures she had witnessed. The build began with the foundation, sunk a foot into the earth. This wasn't merely for stability. It was her first act of thermal defense. The earth below the frost line maintains a relatively constant temperature, around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. By nesting the base of her home in the ground, she was insulating her floor from the brutal -20-degree air, borrowing the planet's thermal mass. Her walls rose to only 5 feet at the eaves, a detail that so offended Clive Seddon. This was a calculated choice to minimize the cabin's profile to the wind. A low wall presented a much smaller target for the wind to press against, dramatically reducing the pressure that drove air infiltration. The logs were smaller, but she took immense care, using a Sami technique of scribing the contours of one log onto the next, creating a fit so tight that it required minimal chinking. The most radical feature, however, was the roof. It was a shallow pitched shed roof, sloping gently from 6.5 feet on the south side down to 5 feet on the north. Crucially, the roof joists extended a full 2 feet beyond the walls on all sides, creating a wide, overhanging eave. To Jedediah Crane, this looked like a clumsy waste of wood. To Maret, it was the essential tool for harvesting her primary building material, snow. The wide eaves were designed not for shade, but to create a calm airspace around the cabin, a place where wind-driven snow would slow down and accumulate, rather than being scoured away. The shallow pitch of the roof was designed not to shed snow, but to hold it. Clive Seddon paid a second visit in early October, his ledger in hand. "Mrs. Era, I came to give you a final warning," he said, his voice stiff. "I have reviewed the territorial statutes. Habitation requires a minimum ceiling height of 7 feet over 50% of the primary living area. Your roof slopes from 6.5 feet down to 5. It fails the standard." Lars, a broad-shouldered and quiet man, stepped forward. "It is a good roof. It is strong." "Strength is not the issue, Mr. Era. The law is the issue," Seddon retorted. He pointed a finger at Mare. "You are building a structure that legally cannot be considered a home. I cannot, in good conscience, approve your patent when the time comes. You are wasting your effort. Tear this down and build properly." Marit was fitting the small, double-paned window on the south-facing wall. She didn't turn around. "The law does not know this winter," she said. Seddon's face flushed with anger. The quiet defiance was more infuriating than any argument. Very well, I will document my official objection. When your family is petitioning the territory for emergency aid in January, remember this conversation. He mounted his horse and rode off, a man secure in his righteousness, leaving the heiress to their strange, foolish work. They had built a home designed to fail every legal standard and to pass the only test that mattered. To understand why Marit was so certain and Clive Seddon so wrong, we have to look at the simple, elegant physics of snow. Snow is not a substance, it is a structure. A snowflake is an intricate crystal of ice, but a snowpack is mostly something else, air. Depending on how it falls and settles, a fresh snowpack can be over 90% trapped air. This is the secret to its incredible insulating power. Air itself is a fantastic insulator, but only if it is held still. Convection, the movement of air, transfers heat with ruthless efficiency. The magic of materials like fiberglass, wool, and snow is their ability to trap millions of tiny pockets of air, preventing convection from occurring. Let's return to the concept of R value. As we established, a 12-inch log wall has an R value of roughly 12. The industry standard R value for a new home's wall in Montana today is R21. The log cabin was woefully under-insulated. Now consider the snow. The R value of snow varies with its density, but a common figure for settled snow is R2 per inch. Marit's design, with its low profile and extended eaves, was engineered to accumulate a 2-foot drift against its walls and on its roof. 24 inches of snow at R2 per inch provides an R value of 48. This number is transformative. Marit wasn't just adding a little insulation. She was encasing her R12 walls and R5 roof in an R48 shell. The total thermal resistance of her walls skyrocketed from 12 to 60. Her roof went from 5 to 53. This meant that for every unit of heat that escaped the Gables cabin, only 1/5 of a unit would escape Marit's. In practical terms, this cuts the heat loss by 80%. Let's quantify this in BTUS, or British thermal units, the standard measure of heat energy. A conventional log cabin on a -20 degrees Fahrenheit night fighting the wind might lose 30,000 BTUS per hour. This requires a large, hot, and constantly fed fire to replace that loss. Marit's cabin, nestled in the still air under its thick snow blanket, would lose less than 6,000 BTUS per hour. This is an amount of heat that can be generated by a small, efficient stove, burning only a few pieces of wood at a time. She had not built a house, she had built a thermos. The mockery had lasted for a season. The validation would last a lifetime. The winter arrived not as a gentle transition, but as an invasion. In mid-November, a gray sky lowered over the Bitterroot Range and did not lift for a month. The temperature dropped, and then it dropped again. The old-timers called it a mountain siege. For 28 consecutive days, the thermometer never rose, above -20 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless wind scoured the valley, sculpting the snow into knife-edged dunes and blasting any exposed surface with an abrasive cold that felt like it could strip flesh from bone. For the Gable family, life became a grim cycle of work and shivering. The wind screamed through the log walls. Frost grew in feathery patterns on the nail heads inside, tiny thermal bridges conducting the cold directly into their living space. They draped their windows with heavy quilts, plunging the cabin into perpetual twilight. They burned wood at a terrifying pace, the pile Silas had stacked in October dwindling to almost nothing by the first week of the siege. Martha Gable watched her youngest son, Thomas, develop a deep, hacking cough that rattled in the frigid air of their home. Every day was a battle, and they were losing ground. A quarter-mile away, Marit Era's world was transformed. Her strange, low cabin performed exactly as she had designed it. The wind, that great enemy of her neighbors, became her collaborator. It swept across the open ground, picked up the loose snow, and deposited it gently in the calm airspace created by her cabin's low profile and wide eaves. Within 3 days, the north and west walls were buried to the roof line. After a week of steady snowfall, the cabin had vanished, replaced by a smooth, white mound, a new feature of the landscape. Only the stovepipe, puffing a lazy curl of smoke, and a narrow shoveled path to the door gave any sign of the life within. Inside that mound was not a tomb, but a sanctuary. The howling of the wind was gone, replaced by a profound, insulated silence. The drafts ceased to exist. The air was still calm, and, most miraculously, warm. The small wood stove glowed with a low, steady fire, consuming a fraction of the wood the gables burned. Lars could sit at the small table mending a bridle, his fingers nimble, not stiff with cold. The children, Niels and Solveig, were not huddled in bed, but were lying on a bearskin rug on the floor, reading a book together in the light from the south-facing window. The most telling proof was that small window pane. On the inside, the bottom edge was fogged with a light film of condensation, the evidence of humidity from breathing, cooking, living. It was proof that the warm, moist air was staying inside. On the outside, just an inch away through the glass, the snow was pressed against the pane. And that snow was not melting, not a single drop. The heat of the cabin was reaching the inner pane, but it was not making it through the glass and into the snow. The house was breathing, living, sealed within its winter shell. They were not surviving the winter. They were inhabiting it. Dr. Alistair Finch was a man who understood the pathologies of cold. He had seen frostbite claim fingers and toes, had treated the pneumonia that settled in chilled lungs, and knew the subtle signs of hypothermia. During the 3rd week of the siege, he made his rounds on a sturdy horse, his medical bag filled with what few remedies he possessed. His visit to the gable cabin left him deeply concerned. He logged the interior temperature in his journal, 29 degrees Fahrenheit. The children were listless, the parents exhausted. As he was leaving, a worried Martha Gable gestured toward the anonymous white mound to the west. "I worry for the Eras, doctor," she said, her own breath pluming in her frigid home. "That foolish woman built a snow grave for her family?" Concerned, Dr. Finch urged his horse toward the drift. With him was Clive Seddon. The registrar had been unable to shake a sense of guilt. He had threatened the Eras, belittled their work. If they were dead, he felt he would bear some responsibility. Together they found the path and cleared the drifted snow from the low door. Seddon knocked, his heart pounding with dread. The door swung inward, and Lars Era stood there, dressed not in a heavy coat but in a simple wool shirt. A wave of air, not cold, not hot, but simply warm, washed over the two men. It was air that held the scent of baking bread and wood smoke. They stepped inside, blinking as their eyes adjusted. The scene that greeted them was one of impossible domestic tranquility. A small fire murmured in the stove. A kettle hummed on its surface. The children looked up from their book, their faces healthy and alert. Dr. Finch pulled off a glove, his scientific curiosity overriding his shock. He had expected to feel the biting cold he felt in every other cabin in the valley. He felt still, gentle warmth. He held his bare hand near the wall. He felt no draft, no radiating cold. It was neutral, like the wall of a well-built home in May. He unbuttoned his coat and pulled out his pocket thermometer, hanging it from a peg near the center of the room. Seddon stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew about building. He walked to the south window. He saw the fog of condensation on the inner pane. He reached out and laid his palm against the glass. It was cool, but not icy. Through it, he could see the crystalline structure of the snow packed against the outside. The proof was undeniable and absolute. The snow wasn't an enemy to be shed. It was a wall to be worn. After 10 minutes, Dr. Finch checked his thermometer. He held it up to the light from the window. 55 degrees, he announced, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. He meticulously recorded the finding in his journal, noting the exterior temperature of minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit, the date, and the conditions at the nearby gable cabin. It was not an anecdote, it was data. Clive Seddon finally turned from the window, his face drained of its usual certainty. He looked at Maret, who was now quietly kneading dough on a floured board. His own regulations, his statutes, his entire worldview seemed absurd in the face of this calm, warm reality. He, the agent of the government, the enforcer of rules, had been the fool. "You didn't build a wall against the winter, Mrs. Era," Seddon said, his voice quiet but clear over the gentle crackle of the fire. "You built a nest within it." The mountain siege broke in the final days of January. As the temperature climbed back toward zero, the story of the Era cabin began to spread. It was carried first by Dr. Finch, a man of science whose word carried weight. He spoke of his temperature logs in the general store, describing the 26-degree difference between the Era cabin and the gable cabin on the same morning. Clive Seddon, however, became the technique's most fervent and official advocate. The man who had once threatened to void Maret's claim now saw her method as a potential salvation for the entire territory. In his quarterly report to the Territorial Land Office in Helena, he dedicated a full section to the Era Snowdrift House. He included a copy of Dr. Finch's logged temperatures and a detailed description of the low-profile, wide-eaved construction. He argued that the existing habitation standards were not only inadequate, but actively dangerous, encouraging settlers to build thermally inefficient structures that wasted resources and endangered lives. His report was copied and circulated to the Territorial Board, which oversaw homesteading policy. The effect was not immediate, but it was profound. The next autumn, 3 new families settling in the upper part of the valley abandoned the traditional tall cabin design and built low-profile homes based on Seddon's descriptions. Silas Blackwood, the logger, ever the pragmatist, began offering a winter-wise lumber package with shorter wall logs and extra-long joists. By the 3rd winter, the sight of a house disappearing under a deliberate blanket of snow was no longer a curiosity, but a sign of a settler who intended to stay. The fuel savings were the most convincing argument of all. Families reported burning less than half the wood they had in previous winters, a savings of labor and resources that could mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving. Maret Era had given the valley not just a new type of house, but a new relationship with winter itself. What Maret Era did in 1879 with logs, earth, and snow was a stunningly effective precursor to the most advanced building science of the 21st century. Her methods anticipated the core principles of the modern passive house movement by over a century. Modern building science obsesses over 2 key things: super insulation and air tightness. A passive house in a cold climate might have walls with an R value of 40 or 60, wrapped in a meticulous air barrier membrane to stop any infiltration. The goal is to create a thermal envelope so effective that the building can be heated almost entirely by passive sources: the sun through the windows, the body heat of the occupants, and waste heat from appliances. Maret's cabin was, in effect, a 19th century passive house. Her log wall was the inner structure, and the 2-foot shell of snow was her super insulation, providing an R value that would meet modern codes. The dense, wind-packed snow also acted as a remarkably effective air barrier, stopping the wind-driven infiltration that plagued her neighbors. By sinking the cabin into the earth, She was even using a form of geothermal temperature stabilization, a technique now employed in advanced earth-sheltered homes. She had created a high-performance home using only intuition, observation, and the materials freely provided by the landscape she inhabited. The deep wisdom of the American frontier was forged in pragmatism. It didn't reward what was written in a law book from a distant capital. It didn't reward what was traditional or what looked impressive. It rewarded what worked. Marit-Era's cabin worked, and in its quiet, undeniable success lay a profound philosophical lesson. The dominant ethos of the age was one of conquest. Humanity's role was to tame the wilderness, to bend nature to its will. The tall cabin standing proud against the sky was the architectural embodiment of that idea, a wooden fortress built to defy the elements. It was a statement of dominance, and it was a statement born of a deep-seated fear of the wild. Maret's approach was rooted not in conquest, but in humility. Her design was an admission that the power of a Montana winter was infinitely greater than the power of a man with an axe. To fight it head-on was to guarantee defeat. The only path to survival, to comfort, was to yield. She didn't build a structure to shed the snow, but one that could wear it as a coat. She didn't build a wall to block the wind, but a shape that would make the wind her servant. It was an act of profound ecological intelligence. She saw winter not as an adversary, but as a system with its own rules and resources. One of those resources was the insulating power of its own snow. By understanding and respecting that system, she was able to turn the very thing her neighbors feared most into her greatest source of comfort and safety. Winter will insulate you. It will protect you if you are humble enough to let it. Her low-slung home, buried in the drifts, was more than a clever design. It was a quiet prayer of respect to the power of the land, and the land answered in kind. Thank you for joining us for this story of ingenuity and survival. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps our channel reach more people who appreciate these forgotten histories. For our next discussion, let's consider this. What modern problems could we solve by looking at nature not as an adversary, but as a partner? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video presents a fictionalized historical narrative for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events are composite creations inspired by historical frontier life. The building techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices and modern thermal science. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and engineering regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.